I often discuss how I'm a second-generation player. Even with me pushing 40 when this video comes out, my father played tabletop role-playing games well before I was born. But he didn't start with Dungeons & Dragons. There was a second game, a variation on Dungeons & Dragons, arguably the first campaign setting ever published by TSR. To give you a frame of reference, first we have the beginning of time. Then some stuff happens we really don't need to get into. Then Tactical Studies Rules is formed in 1973. Dungeons & Dragons comes out in 1974. And this game came out in 1975, 1 year after the release of Dungeons & Dragons. And while there were other supplements that came out afterwards, specifically Blackmore and Greyhawk, also in 1975, this one came out before those. Yes, I have an original copy of the Greyhawk supplement that was published in 1975. This was not a first edition, it's actually an 11th printing coming out from 1979, but still, along with the original Deities and Demigods, it's one of the prized possessions that I have in my collection. Tactical Studies Rules dissolved after releasing Dungeons & Dragons in 1974, then reformed into TSR Hobbies. But even the Greyhawk and Blackmore supplements, the two first supplements done for D&D, came out after this product. And while these two products were named after Gary Gygax's Greyhawk setting and Dave Arneson's Blackmore setting, they did not actually include the settings as part of the supplements. This was the first release from TSR Hobbies, the first campaign setting ever published by the company. Rick Swan, game designer, game critic, and author of The Complete Guide to Role-Playing, said this setting, quote, is without peer, a richly developed, exhaustively detailed treatment of a truly alien setting. This was the second RPG product released by the company, the one they put out right after Dungeons & Dragons. The Empire of the Petal Throne. The world of Tecumel was, as the kids say, built different. Born of the same linguistic passion that gave us Middle-earth, its creator was a linguist first, storyteller second. Just like Tolkien, M.A.R. Barker was a professor of languages. But in contrast to Tolkien, an English professor, M.A.R. Barker was a professor of Urdu and South Asian studies. For those that don't know, Urdu is an Indo-Aryan language that is the national language of Pakistan, spoken extensively in the subcontinent of India. M.A.R. Barker was born Philip Barker in 1929. In 1951, he converted to Islam as he found it the, quote, only logical religion. He changed his name to Muhammad Abd al-Rahman. He became passionate about Islam, Urdu, and married a Pakistani woman. He poured his love of these things into Tecumel. Again, like Tolkien, Barker created entire fictional languages for his world. The most fleshed out of these was Silyani, the name of the titular empire of the Petal Throne. Silyani was read from right to left, like Urdu. Barker wrote a pronunciation guide in 1979 that you can still buy in PDF form on DriveThruRPG. Barker ended up writing 5 novels in Tecumel, published between 1984 and 2003. Now, Barker had heard of Dungeons & Dragons in 1974. A gamer as well, he decided to make his own rule set for a game to play in his created world. Dave Arneson, the co-creator of Dungeons & Dragons, caught wind of this. It eventually got the attention of Gary Gygax, the other co-creator, and they decided to release it as a product from TSR Hobbies. This is how, in 1975, TSR released their version of Empire of the Petal Throne. This game was somewhat innovative. From my research, it appears to be the first game to introduce comeliness as an attribute, comeliness being the stat for how physically beautiful your character was. I didn't say the innovations were all good. Dungeons & Dragons actually tried this attribute as an optional rule with the release of Unearthed Arcana in 1985, but it never made it into the full game and was dropped entirely by the time 3rd edition came out in 2000. It also appears to have introduced the concept of the critical hit. The idea that if you rolled this magical 20, you did double damage, or even killed your opponent outright.
With advantage?
Yeah!
Last man standing, 20!
Natural 20.
I mean, That seems to be a keeper in the D20-based systems to this day. And with its intensely fleshed out world, with different cultures, languages that Barker actually constructed, and history, it's easy to see why gamers playing the game primarily focused on dungeon crawls would latch onto this concept of the realized fantasy world to play in so readily. At the time, most dungeon masters would create a multi-level dungeon. Now, you could take your character from one table to the other because the concept of the dungeon master having a singular world that they designed wasn't as popular or prevalent as it is now. That isn't to say that it didn't happen in those early days, it just wasn't as common. So this setting comes along and puts an entirely new fantasy world in front of the players. Maps, kingdoms, religions, languages, cultures. This level of detail was very ahead of its time because, like Ed Greenwood did with the Forgotten Realms, Barker had a head start. The world was started as a hobby unto itself, a passion project for novels, or just a way to construct languages. As previously mentioned, Barker did eventually write 5 novels in the world of Tekkamel over the years, in addition to the game books, source books, and helping with new editions of the game that came out as recently as 2005. Of course, M.A.R. Barker wrote other things as well. Content warning: anti-Semitism and racism. In 1991, Barker, under the pseudonym Randolph Culverhall, wrote Serpent's Walk, a novel that begins in the near future of 2041, 100 years after the United States entered World War II. So, what's this book about? We can read the back of the book to get the summary. The good guys win sometimes. Not always, of course. They lost big in the Second World War. That war was a victory for communists, Democrats, and Jews, but everyone else lost. Hitler's elite warriors, the SS, didn't give up their struggle for the white world when they lost the Second World War. Instead, their survivors went underground. A century after the war, they are ready to challenge the Democrats and Jews for the hearts and minds of white Americans, who have begun to have their fill of government-enforced multiculturalism and equality. This novel was published by National Vanguard Books, the same publisher of the Turner Diaries, which has been called the Bible of the Racist Right.
Hey folks, Editing Kimchi here. I found literally hundreds of sources stating that the FBI referred to this book as the Bible of the Racist Right. However, I was unable to find where the FBI said this specific statement. News article after news article, Southern Poverty Law Center, encyclopedias, all of them stated that the FBI refers to this book as the Bible of the Racist Right. But I couldn't find any first-hand primary source of the FBI making this statement. If it's on a list somewhere, I just couldn't find it. I think it came out during the Timothy McVeigh trial. It may have been in the transcripts there, and it could just be something where there's no news article that specifically talks about it being spoken in the trial. But I was unable to find it. There's probably a source out there. I apologize. But I left it in the video because it has been cited so many times as the Bible of the Racist Right.
The book that inspired the Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh. What is National Vanguard? Well, National Vanguard, per their own words, are white supremacists, espousing clearly racist and anti-Semitic beliefs. These people are unapologetic. They're based out of Charlottesville, by the way, if that rings any bells to you. News went public in 2022 when the Tekkamel Foundation released a statement confirming the rumors that Barker wrote Serpent's Walk. They apparently sat on that information for years. The foundation was created in 2008 by Barker as the administrator to his work. It has continued, since his death, to preserve Tekkamel and sell products relating to it. Since the revelation of Mr. Barker's activities, a portion of the proceeds for products sold about Tekkamel go to the Jewish Community Relations Council and Holocaust educational organizations. While I can applaud that, the board of directors is still run by his spouse, Aberdeen Barker, and while she is Pakistani, I can't help but wonder what she knew or participated in with regards to her husband's wildly anti-Semitic work. As with anything that comes to the surface recently, when the news came out, there was denial. Some claimed that it was an ill-conceived joke, some sort of prank, or what some social media influencers today might refer to as a social experiment. Some stated that from their personal knowledge of the man, there was no way he could be racist. The denial was strong, but more details were uncovered. For 12 years, from 1990 to 2002, Barker, under his birth name, Philip, served on the editorial board for the Journal of Historical Review until they ceased publication. Now you may ask, what was the Journal of Historical Review? It was a Holocaust-denying white supremacist organization. Per the Southern Poverty Law Center, they are considered an extremist hate group. While they claim that they are not hateful, not bigoted, not Holocaust deniers, every single essay from their founder concerns Israel and the Jewish people. 9/11? Fault of the Jews. Iraq War and occupation? Fault of the Jews. Holocaust museums? Jewish propaganda. They make the claim that every major American city has a Holocaust museum and memorial. I live in the 10th largest city in the U.S., and we don't have one. They also want there to be free speech in regards to history, but more specifically, the actions of the German government in the 1930s and 40s, and the ability to question the official story of this so-called Holocaust. Here are just some quotes from Mark Weber of the Institute for Historical Review, the group who published the Journal for Historical Review. In his essay, Anti-Semitism, Why Does This Exist, and Why Does It Persist?
Anti-Semitism is not an aberration, but rather a natural response by non-Jews to alien Jewish behavior and attitudes. Anti-Jewish sentiment is not due to ignorance or bigotry, as so many have claimed. Instead, the ancient and seemingly intractable conflict between Jews and non-Jews is entirely understandable, because Jews are a distinct and separate people with interests that are different from, and which often conflict with, the interests of people among whom they live. Anti-Semitism is not a mysterious disease. As Herzl and Weizmann suggested, and as history shows, what is often called anti-Semitism is the natural and understandable attitude of people toward a minority with particular loyalties that wield greatly disproportionate power for its own interests, rather than for the common good.
So, yeah. Barker worked for this guy, aligned himself with him for over 10 years, until the journal's dissolution in 2002. This was not a fluke. This was not a joke. This was not a prank. M.A.R. Barker was a clear-cut, anti-Semitic bigot. It reminds me of the old saying in Germany, if you sit at a table with 10 people and 1 Nazi, you have a table with 11 Nazis. Barker sat at a table with 10 Nazis, and you can't look me in the eye and say that he was the only one at the table that wasn't one. Barker died in 2012. He was heralded by Wired magazine as the Lost Tolkien. Obviously, the writer of the article didn't know that M.A.R. Barker was, well, who he was. Very few did. And the gaming community was mostly clueless until 2022. He did a really good job of hiding it. And few folks were sniffing around an old gaming figurehead from the 1970s who died 10 years ago. But where does that leave his creation? What about Tecumel? The last time materials for the game were published was in 2005. Tecumel will probably fade even more into the background, a forgotten artifact from a bygone age. Or maybe at some point folks will revisit it. Empire of the Petal Throne isn't an exceptionally racist game. Oddly enough, especially for its time, it was very respectful to the cultures that it drew from. Now, I'm no expert in these areas, so I asked some friends for help. Remembering that this was in the 1970s, their responses were, aside from a little bit of Orientalism, it wasn't that bad. The author's prejudice doesn't always make the works lose their luster in the public consciousness, especially when the author is dead. So many people resonate with H.P. Lovecraft's work as innovative in his field, and he wore his hatred on his sleeve. Of course, Most of the Lovecraft fans that I know who champion his work, even while acknowledging his faults, are white. So they weren't the targets of his hatred in many cases. So maybe it isn't up to me to defend or rehabilitate his image. It isn't up to people like me to say whether or not his art is worth saving. But it is the responsibility of all of us to acknowledge the skeletons in the closet of the things that we love. This is one of the many in Tabletop Gaming's closet. Take a second to look at it, lest we forget. Thanks for watching.
As always, folks, I want to thank you for checking out the video. Also, special thanks to my executive producer tier patrons, Les Howie, Caleb Lackey, and Sidekick. Thank you all for your support. Like I said, more videos are coming soon, so stay tuned. They're going to keep on rolling.